The wind howled like a hungry wolf outside Sarah Caldwell's small wooden cabin, rattling the shutters and sneaking icy fingers through every crack. Winter had come early to the Texas frontier this year, and it showed no mercy. Sarah pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stirred the pot of beans simmering over the fire. It had been 6 months since her husband disappeared during a Comanche raid, and the loneliness weighed heavier than the snow piling up outside. Outside, the world was silent except for the creak of frozen branches. Sarah's breath made little clouds in the air as she peered through the small window, watching the last light of dusk fade into a starless night. She was just about to bolt the door when she heard a faint sound, almost lost in the wind. A knock. Her heart jumped into her throat. No one should be out in this storm. Settlers knew better than to travel in such weather, and Comanche raiders wouldn't knock. Cautiously, she lifted the latch and opened the door just enough to see. There, half buried in the snow, stood a boy. He couldn't have been more than 12 years old, his dark hair dusted with snow, his thin clothing no match for the cold. His lips were blue, his arms wrapped tightly around himself as he shivered. For a heartbeat, Sarah hesitated. She knew the stories Comanche warriors were dangerous, and even a child could be a scout. But the boy's eyes, wide with exhaustion and fear, reminded her of a lost fawn she'd once sheltered. Without another thought, she grabbed his arm and pulled him inside. The boy stumbled in, his legs stiff with cold. Sarah hurried to stoke the fire, then wrapped him in the thickest blanket she owned, a wool one her mother had woven years ago. She ladled hot broth into a tin cup and pressed it into his hands. The boy didn't speak, but his dark eyes flickered with something like gratitude as he drank. Sarah watched him, wondering who he was and where he'd come from. Had he been separated from his tribe? Was he alone like her? She thought about asking, but the boy's weariness was plain, so she simply pointed to the pile of furs by the fire. He curled up there without a word, and within minutes, his breathing slowed into sleep. Sarah sat by the fire long into the night, listening to the wind and watching the boy. She knew she'd taken a risk letting him in. If his people came looking for him, they might not be as peaceful. But leaving him outside would have been a death sentence, and she couldn't have lived with that. When dawn finally crept through the window, Sarah woke to find the boy gone. The door was unlatched, and her blanket was missing. She stepped outside, scanning the snow for footprints, but the wind had already erased them. It was as if he'd never been there at all. Shivering, Sarah hugged herself and wondered what she'd just set in motion. The morning sun glittered on the snow as Sarah carried a bucket of milk back from the barn. The cow had been restless all night, as if sensing something strange in the air. Sarah patted the animal's flank, her breath curling in the crisp air. She still couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Where had he come from? Why was he alone in such a storm? She was halfway to the cabin when she heard the distant drum of hooves. Her grip tightened on the bucket. Horses meant riders, and riders could mean trouble. The nearest settlement was miles away, and no neighbor would come calling without warning. Heart pounding, she turned slowly toward the sound. A group of riders emerged from the treeline, their figures dark against the snow. Even at a distance, Sarah recognized the feathered lances and painted ponies. Comanche. For a wild moment, she thought about running, but where would she go? The cabin was no fortress, and she couldn't outride warriors. So she stood frozen, milk sloshing over the edge of the bucket as the riders approached. At the front was the boy from last night. No longer shivering and frail, he sat straight on his pony, wrapped in her wool blanket. Beside him rode a broad-shouldered man with a face like weathered stone, his hair streaked with gray and adorned with eagle feathers. The chief. The warriors fanned out around her yard, their expressions unreadable. The chief raised a hand, and the group halted. Silence stretched like a bowstring about to snap. Then the boy spoke, his voice clear and strong. He said something in Comanche, gesturing to Sarah. The chief studied her with dark, piercing eyes before dismounting. When he spoke, his words were slow but deliberate in English. "You gave my son shelter. You gave him your blanket." He touched the wool wrapped around the boy's shoulders. "In our ways, this has meaning." Sarah's throat went dry. I only wanted to help. He was freezing. The chief nodded, as if that explained everything. A woman who takes in a warrior, who gives him warmth, this is a promise among our people. You have taken him into your home. Now you are his wife. Sarah nearly dropped the bucket. Wife. But he's a child. The boy Little Hawk, as she would later learn, frowned, clearly insulted. The chief's expression didn't change. He is old enough to ride with warriors. Old enough to have a home. He gestured to the cabin. You live alone. This is not good for a woman. You will come with us. The words hit like a slap. Sarah's mind raced. If she refused, would they drag her away? Burn her home? Yet the chief's tone held no malice, only certainty, as if this were the most natural arrangement in the world. One of the warriors muttered something, his hand resting on his knife. Sarah's pulse roared in her ears. Then Little Hawk surprised her. He slid off his pony and stepped forward, his young face earnest. You are kind, he said carefully in English. My father honors that. No harm will come to you. The chief nodded once, as if that settled it. Bring what you need. We leave now. Sarah looked back at her cabin, the home she'd built with her husband, the last place that felt like hers. Then she looked at the warriors, their patience wearing thin. She had no weapons, no allies, and against the iron will of the Comanche, no real choice. With a trembling breath, she turned toward the cabin. I'll get my things. Sarah clutched the reins of the old mare they had given her, her knuckles white beneath her woolen gloves. The saddle creaked with each step as the Comanche band moved steadily across the open plain, leaving her cabin and her old life shrinking behind her in the distance. The late morning sun did little to warm the brittle winter air, and every exhale hung like fog before her face. Little Hawk rode slightly ahead, his posture straight and proud now, so different from the shivering child she had taken in. Occasionally, he glanced back at her, his dark eyes unreadable. Sarah wondered if he was as uneasy about this arrangement as she was. The landscape changed as they traveled, open grasslands giving way to rolling hills dotted with winter-bare trees. Sarah had never ventured this far beyond the settlement before. Everything felt vast and unfamiliar, the silence broken only by the rhythmic hoofbeats and the occasional call of a distant hawk. As dusk approached, the chief raised a hand, signaling the group to halt near a sheltered grove. The warriors dismounted smoothly, but Sarah's stiff legs nearly gave way when her feet touched the ground. A young woman with intricate beadwork on her deerskin dress approached, eyeing Sarah curiously before saying something in rapid Comanche to Little Hawk. He turned to Sarah. My sister, Falling Leaf. She says you look like a newborn deer standing for the first time. Sarah flushed, realizing how awkward she must appear among these people who moved with such natural grace. Falling Leaf smiled slightly and reached for Sarah's saddlebags. No, I can, Sarah began, but the young woman had already shouldered the burden effortlessly. Little Hawk touched Sarah's elbow. Let her help. You're family now. The words struck her strangely. Family. She watched as the camp sprang to life around her, women unpacking bundles, children laughing as they gathered firewood, elders settling onto woven mats. The smells of cooking meat and herbs filled the air, so different from the simple meals she prepared alone in her cabin. An older woman with silver streaking her long braids approached, her sharp eyes assessing Sarah from head to toe. She spoke to Little Hawk, who translated. Grandmother asks why your hands are so pale and soft. Did you not work in your white village? Sarah looked down at her hands, calloused from years of homesteading but undoubtedly less weathered than those of the Comanche women. I worked, she said defensively, just differently. The grandmother bright star, as Sarah would come to know her, snorted and took Sarah's hand, turning it palm up. She said something that made the nearby women chuckle. Little Hawk's mouth quirked. She says she will teach you to work properly. Starting tomorrow. That night, wrapped in a borrowed buffalo robe near the central fire, Sarah stared up at the unfamiliar stars. The sounds of the camp settling, quiet conversations, the soft nickering of horses were so different from the lonely creaks of her cabin. She thought about running, but to where? The wilderness stretched endlessly in every direction. Little Hawk appeared silently beside her, holding out a wooden bowl of steaming stew. "Eat," he said simply. "Tomorrow will be hard for you." As Sarah took the bowl, their fingers brushed briefly. In that moment, she realized with startling clarity that despite the strangeness of it all, no one in this camp had treated her with cruelty. Only curiosity. And perhaps, in their own way, a sort of kindness. She took a tentative bite of the stew, rich with flavors she couldn't name, and wondered what tomorrow would truly bring in this world she had been thrust into. The first light of dawn had barely touched the horizon when Bright Star shook Sarah awake. The old woman's face was stern in the gray morning light as she thrust a woven basket into Sarah's hands and pointed toward the edge of camp where other women were already gathering. Sarah's stiff muscles protested as she scrambled up, her breath visible in the crisp air. Little Hawk's grandmother led her to a patch of winter-dry grass where several women knelt, their fingers moving deftly as they harvested something from the frozen earth. Bright Star crouched and dug her fingers into the hard soil, pulling up a gnarled root. She held it out to Sarah, speaking rapidly in Comanche. A younger girl named Morning Bird, who knew a few English words, pointed at the root. "For medicine. You dig." Sarah knelt awkwardly, the cold earth numbing her fingers as she tried to mimic the women's movements. Her first attempts were clumsy, the roots breaking in her hands. The women clicked their tongues but showed her again patiently. By the time the sun had fully risen, Sarah's back ached and her fingertips were raw, but her basket held a few intact roots. Bright Star inspected her harvest with a critical eye, then surprised Sarah by nodding approval. The old woman motioned for Sarah to follow her to a large hide stretched between poles where other women were scraping a buffalo skin with bone tools. The smell of raw hide made Sarah's stomach turn, but she watched carefully as Bright Star demonstrated the proper angle to hold the scraper. "Like this," Morning Bird translated as Bright Star guided Sarah's hands. "Not too hard, not too soft." Sarah's first strokes were uneven, leaving patches of hair clinging to the hide. Some of the younger girls giggled behind their hands, but Bright Star silenced them with a sharp look. The old woman's hands covered Sarah's again, adjusting her grip. The rhythmic scraping became almost meditative, and by midday, Sarah had managed to clean a small section properly. As they paused to eat a simple meal of dried meat and crushed berries, Sarah noticed Little Hawk watching from where the young men trained with bows. When he saw her looking, he quickly turned away, but not before Sarah caught the hint of a smile. In the afternoon, Bright Star led Sarah to a shaded area where elderly women sat spinning thread from buffalo wool. The spindle looked deceptively simple, but Sarah's first attempt sent wool flying in every direction. The old women laughed good-naturedly as Sarah chased after the rolling spindle. One particularly ancient woman with milky eyes took pity on her. She grasped Sarah's hands in her own gnarled ones and moved them through the motion slowly, humming as she did so. To Sarah's amazement, the wool began to twist into something resembling thread. As the sun dipped low, Sarah's entire body ached in ways she hadn't known possible. Her hands were blistered, her knees bruised from kneeling, and her back protested every movement. Yet when Bright Star handed her a small portion of the roots she'd helped harvest to add to the evening stew, Sarah felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. That night around the fire, as Sarah struggled to chew the tough jerky they'd given her, Little Hawk sat beside her. "Grandmother says you learn fast," he said quietly. "For a white woman." Sarah huffed a tired laugh. "Tell your grandmother my hands may never work right again." Little Hawk actually grinned at that, a flash of white teeth in the firelight. "Tomorrow will be worse," he promised, but there was something almost like camaraderie in his voice now. As Sarah lay down to sleep, her body protesting every movement, she realized with surprise that she was curious about what worse might entail. The thought was so unexpected that she almost laughed aloud as she watched the sky. For 3 weeks, Sarah's hands had bled, cracked, and finally hardened. She could now dig roots without breaking them, scrape hides clean enough to satisfy even Bright Star's critical eye, and spin thread that didn't immediately unravel. The Comanche women no longer watched her with amused skepticism but included her in their work as naturally as if she had always been there. Then the dreams came. At first, Sarah thought nothing of the restless nights where she saw her old cabin standing empty, its door banging in the wind. But when the visions began showing blue-coated soldiers riding through the village, their guns spitting fire, she woke drenched in sweat, her heart hammering against her ribs. She mentioned it to no one until the morning. She found Little Hawk sharpening his hunting knife with unusual intensity. "What troubles you?" she asked in the halting Comanche she'd begun to learn. He didn't look up. "The buffalo grows scarce where they should be plentiful. Our scouts found wagon tracks where no settlers should travel." His knife scraped along the whetstone with a sound that made Sarah's teeth ache. "Something comes." That afternoon, as Sarah helped pound dried meat into pemmican, the wind shifted. It carried a scent that didn't belong: wood smoke, yes, but also the metallic tang of gun oil. The women froze mid-motion, their nostrils flaring like wary deer. Bright Star's hands tightened around her grinding stone. Before anyone could speak, a horned owl called twice from the ridge. A signal. The village erupted into controlled chaos. Children herded toward the center lodges, weapons distributed, horses readied. Sarah stood paralyzed until Little Hawk shoved a parfleche of medical herbs into her arms. "With the grandmothers," he ordered, already turning to join the warriors. The attack came at dusk. First came the thunder of hooves, then the unearthly war cries as Comanche riders swept out to meet the threat. Sarah crouched in the medicine lodge with the elders, straining to hear over the pounding of her own blood. The sharp retorts of rifles mixed with the twang of bows, the screams of wounded horses, the guttural shouts of fighting men. When the first wounded were carried in, Sarah's hands moved without conscious thought. She packed wounds with yarrow, bound shattered limbs with splints, and whispered reassurances she didn't feel. A warrior barely older than Little Hawk gripped her wrist as she cleaned his arrow wound. "You fight with us," he gasped in broken English. The battle raged through the night. By dawn, the raiders, a mix of bounty hunters and disgruntled settlers, had retreated, leaving 3 Comanche dead and twice that many wounded. The village smelled of blood and burning sage. Sarah found Little Hawk at the edge of camp, his knuckles raw from fighting. "They wanted horses," he said without preamble. "But they saw our lodges and thought to take more." His eyes were older than his years when he met her gaze. "This is only the beginning." As Sarah helped prepare the dead for burial, she noticed the way the tribe now looked at her no longer as an outsider, but as someone who had stood with them in the storm. Even Bright Star's nod carried new weight. That night, Sarah dreamed again. But this time, instead of her empty cabin, she saw a vast plain where 2 rivers met, one blue as soldiers' coats, one dark as buffalo blood, and knew with terrible certainty that choices were coming that would divide more than land. When she woke, the first snow of winter was falling, covering yesterday's bloodstains in perfect white. Little Hawk stood watching the horizon, his blanket dusted with flakes. "The hard times are here," he said quietly. Sarah wrapped her own blanket tighter and stood beside him. For the first time, she didn't think of it as his blanket. It was theirs. Winter tightened its grip on the plains. The snow fell thicker now, muffling the world in eerie silence. Sarah woke each morning to find frost coating the inside of the lodge, her breath hanging frozen before her face as she hurried to rebuild the fire. The village moved slower these days, conserving energy, stretching stored food supplies as the hunting parties returned with leaner hauls. One brittle morning, Sarah noticed an unusual stir near the chief's lodge. Warriors clustered together, their voices low but urgent. Little Hawk returned from the meeting, with his jaw set tight. "The Bluecoats have sent messengers," he told Sarah as she sorted medicinal herbs. "They wish to speak of peace." Sarah's hands stilled. She'd heard enough stories from the settlers' side to know how often government promises turn to lies. "Will your father meet with them?" Little Hawk's eyes darkened. "He must. The people are hungry, and the Bluecoats hold the winter supplies promised in last year's treaty." He turned a bone-handled knife over in his hands. "But their words are like river ice, pretty to look at, but treacherous to trust. 3 days later, the chief and his chosen warriors prepared to ride out. Sarah watched as Little Hawk, dressed in his finest regalia, beaded moccasins, a painted buffalo robe, eagle feathers braided into his hair. He looked every inch the proud Comanche warrior, though he'd seen only 15 winters. Sarah caught his arm as he moved toward his pony. "Take this." She pressed a small pouch into his hand. "Yarrow for wounds, willow bark for pain." Little Hawk hesitated, then tucked the pouch inside his shirt. "You begin to think like one of us," he said quietly. Sarah shook her head. "I'm thinking like someone who wants you to come back." The village waited in tense silence after the peace party left. Women went about their chores with distracted hands, children played quieter games, even the dogs seemed to sense the unease. At night, Sarah lay awake listening for returning hoofbeats. On the 4th morning, the lookout's cry sent the entire village rushing to the eastern edge of camp. Sarah's heart climbed into her throat as she counted the returning riders, fewer than had left. Little Hawk rode slumped in his saddle, one arm clutched across his stomach. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his painted robe black in the morning light. Behind him, warriors carried the chief's body lashed to a travois, his face covered with a beaded shroud. Sarah moved before she could think, rushing forward to help lower Little Hawk from his horse. His skin burned with fever beneath her hands. "What happened?" she demanded as she cut away his blood-soaked shirt. Little Hawk's teeth chattered as he spoke. "Ambush at the council ground. They wanted our weapons first, then opened fire." His eyes rolled back as Sarah pressed a clean hide against the oozing bullet wound. "Father fell, protecting our retreat." As Sarah worked to clean and stitch the wound, the wails of mourning women filled the air. The village elders gathered in urgent council while warriors sharpened weapons with grim determination. That night, by the flickering light of the chief's funeral pyre, the new leader Gray Bear, the chief's war-scarred brother, addressed the people. "The Bluecoats have shown their true hearts," he declared. "Now we show ours. We ride at dawn to avenge our fallen." A chorus of approval rose from the warriors, but Sarah saw the doubt in the elders' eyes, the fear in the mothers holding their children close. She turned to Little Hawk, pale but conscious on his sickbed. "This is what they want," she whispered urgently. "They'll be waiting for you." Little Hawk's hand found hers, his grip surprisingly strong. "Then you must go to them first." Sarah recoiled. "Me? You speak their tongue. Know their ways." His fever-bright eyes bored into hers. "Go as my voice. Tell them, we will have peace, but not surrender. Tell them to honor their word, or face the consequences." Sarah opened her mouth to refuse, then stopped. She looked around at the faces she'd come to know, bright stars' stubborn pride, falling leaves' quiet strength, the children who had begun to call her by name. This was no longer just about survival. It was about belonging. As the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall, Sarah squared her shoulders. "I'll need a fast horse," she said. Little Hawk's answering smile was thin but fierce. "Take Wind Dancer. And take this." He pressed the bone-handled knife into her palm. "For the fork in the road ahead." Sarah tucked the knife into her belt, feeling its weight against her hip like a promise. At dawn, she would ride alone into the soldiers' camp. Either she would return with peace, or she would not return at all. Sarah rode through the frozen dawn, the wind biting at her cheeks. Wind Dancer moved swiftly beneath her, his breath puffing white in the cold air. She wore a borrowed buckskin dress, her hair braided in the Comanche way, but the bone-handled knife at her belt reminded her of the choice. She carried neither fully white nor fully Comanche, but something in between. The soldiers' camp appeared like a scar on the land rows of canvas tents, the smell of coffee and gunpowder drifting through the trees. Sentries spotted her long before she reached them, their rifles snapping up as she approached with empty hands raised. "State your business," barked a sergeant with a thick mustache. Sarah kept her voice steady. "I come to speak with your commander. On behalf of Little Hawk's band." The soldiers exchanged glances. One muttered, "That's a white woman." Minutes later, Sarah stood before Colonel Hendricks, a broad-shouldered man with cold blue eyes. He studied her like a curiosity. "You're the Caldwell woman," he said. "We thought you were dead." "I was taken in," Sarah said carefully. "Not forced. There's been a misunderstanding." The colonel snorted. "Misunderstanding? They ambushed our peace envoys." Sarah's hands clenched. "Your men fired first. The chief was killed under a white flag." Silence fell. The colonel's expression darkened. "You expect me to believe that?" Sarah met his gaze. "I expect you to honor your treaties. The Comanche are willing to talk peace, but not while your soldiers starve their children and shoot their leaders." The colonel leaned back in his chair. "And if we refuse?" Sarah didn't blink. "Then the war will never end. And you'll have more blood on your hands than this land can swallow." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackling fire in the stove. Then the colonel exhaled sharply. "We'll send new envoys. Under full protection. But if this is a trick..." "It's not." Sarah pulled the bone knife from her belt and laid it on the table. "This belonged to Little Hawk's father. He sends it as a pledge of good faith." The colonel picked up the knife, turning it in the light. Then slowly he nodded. 2 weeks later, Sarah stood at the edge of the Comanche camp, watching as the bluecoat delegation approached under a truce banner. Little Hawk, still healing but standing tall, waited beside Gray Bear. The air was thick with tension, but no hands reached for weapons. As the colonel dismounted, his eyes found Sarah. "You'll act as translator?" She shook her head. "I'll stand with them." Little Hawk's hand brushed hers, just briefly, but it was enough. The talks lasted 3 days. There were arguments, concessions, old wounds laid bare. But when the final agreement was made, the promise of food, the return of hunting grounds, the guarantee of safe passage, Sarah felt something unclench in her chest. That night, as the camp celebrated, Bright Star handed Sarah a newly woven blanket, its patterns intricate and beautiful. "For your lodge," the old woman said simply. Sarah ran her fingers over the soft wool, remembering the first blanket she'd given Little Hawk on that freezing night. Now, she understood what it truly meant, not ownership, but belonging. As the firelight danced across the faces of the people she had once feared, Sarah realized she was no longer a captive, a wife, or even a guest. She was home. The end.